Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled Climate Adoption Policies in the Indian Sundarbans, Assessing a One-Size-Fits-All Approach. The webinar is organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. We are delighted to have with us as the guest speaker, Dr. Annabel Delhanty. Dr. Delhanty is a lecturer at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Today's session is chaired by Dr. Imran Ahmed. He is a research fellow at ISAS. Before we go further with today's webinar, I would request everyone in attendance to turn off their cameras and mute their microphones in order to ensure that there is no disturbance. The session will also be open for audience questions. So if you may have any questions during the session, you can put them on the Zoom chat, and these will be consolidated later for the guest speaker to answer. This event is also being live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. I now invite Dr. Imran Ahmed to make the introductory remarks and chair the session.
Thank you so much, Syed, and a very good afternoon to everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's seminar. We'll be delving into an important topic that very much demands our attention and action: the impact of climate change on marginalised communities. Today, we're here to discuss the findings and outcomes of the Climate Affected Communities Project led by Dr. Annabel Delhanty, Ms. Sukanya Banerjee, and Professor Kuntala Lahiri Dutt. The primary objective of this project has been to explore whether climate change affects individuals differently based on gender, disability, and social inclusion, and to identify adaptation strategies that can best meet the needs of these vulnerable people. The project is focused on Goramara Island in West Bengal, India, a place that is currently facing severe threats due to climate change. Today's seminar provides us with a unique opportunity to gain insights into the challenges faced by marginalized communities in the wake of climate change. Dr. Annabel's research over the years has addressed the impact of development programs on those facing intersectional disadvantages. She has looked at the effectiveness of different aid interventions, particularly in the promotion of women's empowerment, and published her findings in journals such as Mobilities, Journal of International Development, Oxford Development Studies, amongst many others. She'll be speaking for 30 to 40 minutes before we open the floor for discussion. Annabel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really delighted to speak to you all, and really hope to connect with many of you after. I'm zooming here from Australia, so I just want to acknowledge the Dharawal people whose land I'm currently working on. And thank you very much. And I will talk throughout, and happy to answer any questions that you may have. And just let me know if you can't hear me or any other issues arise. So, sorry, thanks. So here, I'm talking here about the work that I've been doing with my colleagues on this climate adaptation project. So I must acknowledge them. As Dr. Ahmed said, I am at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU, and I've been working there with my colleague, Professor Lahiri Dutt, and also with Ms. Sukanya Banerjee, a PhD student who's teaching at Rabindra Bharati University. So we've been the co-investigators working on this project. It's had a few different iterations so far. And I guess today I wanted to share with you a bit about the project, but also a bit broader about how our findings fit into the general sort of understanding of climate adaptation, and what that means for the planning of different climate adaptation plans and strategies. So essentially, at the heart of this research has been an acknowledgement that we have so many different climate action plans being developed, whether that's at the nation state level or at different states or different local councils around the world globally, have been developing them now for the past sort of 15 years or so. And often they're getting updated, but many are still in process, of undergoing review. So, and we have, for example, in India, there's the 2008 National Action Plan for Climate Change, and we have, many countries around the world doing this. But one issue we find across many of them is that they are very much based around a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. So many of these different action plans and strategies will, we'll talk about the effects of climate change. They might, have one or two lines about how this impacts women, but they're not really looking at a sort of deep dive at how it really affects the most marginalised. And we know from decades of research that climate change has a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable. It has a disproportionate impact on women with highly gendered results. And it also, severely impacts those who are discriminated against based on race or caste or tribe. It affects the elderly, it affects the youth, it affects people with disabilities. So we can't then say that sort of broad climate strategies that don't look at these differential aspects are going to be useful. So our project essentially is focused on the different diversity of needs amongst individuals, also looked at food and water security and climate change in a very specific location in Goromara Island. So as I mentioned, these common issues that this project is tapping into is around the fact that many national action plans are developed, but they don't have much reference here to GEDSI, which is essentially looking at gender, disability, and social inclusion. And most of the time, and this is something that Imran was bringing up earlier on, communities aren't consulted. So we see in many different examples of poor policies being rolled out, it's where they haven't gone to consult the most marginalised, the most affected by these policies. We also see that in many cases, different governments will have they'll have a gender sort of action plan and they'll have a climate action plan, but many of them don't intersect that much. You won't have the gender people working on the climate plan and you won't have the climate people working on the gender plan. And so they sort of end up siloed. And similarly, if there's plans on people with disabilities or plans on youth or the elderly, and the extent to which they inform each other is quite limited. And we also see that, in every single country in the world, there is expertise, people working on gender, working on disability, working on social inclusion. But often you'll find that these people weren't consulted in the development of these different action plans. So we can discuss that a bit later, but I guess just to highlight the approach that we were looking at, in looking at GEDSI, we essentially have been trying to use this as a methodology, not just for how we promote climate adaptation plans should be, but also for our research methodology. And so in using this approach, looking at gender equality, disability, and social inclusion, we essentially wish to focus on transformational change and what policies or programs might lead to gender transformative change. So if you see here, these arrows down the bottom, you can see that we have a continuum from being GEDSI unaware or harmful, where policies or programs might just not even mention gender, not even mention social inclusion, and they may basically have unintended impacts, or they might be harmful. Or we see that they might mention things to do with gender and social inclusion, which is GEDSI aware, or they might be more responsive and accommodating and try to add some, really good ideas into the policy, but they're not essentially transformative, or they can be transformative. So our aim is to look at what is transformative. Also here, looking at use of an intersectional analysis. This is an understanding that most disadvantaged groups don't just have one issue. They're not just facing gender discrimination, but they might also be facing class discrimination, caste discrimination. They might be discriminated on the basis of their age or their disability or whatnot. So it's important that we look at all these intersecting factors together. So we've used mixed methods, including participatory approaches, and the use of photo voice, where we captured, we enabled women to take photos of their experiences. And here, also looking at power dynamics, not just including women. Sometimes in a very sort of superficial gendered approach, it might just say, okay, well, how much does this include women? But really what we're wanting to look at is the power dynamics underpinning this. So the questions to ask overall, when we're looking at a national action plan or a local action plan, or an NGO's action plan on climate adaptation, for example, is first of all, is there a GEDSI approach at all? Is there gender equality, disability, social inclusion mentioned? Does it come across? Has there been consultation? What are the differential aspects on these groups? And we see with climate change and climate adaptation, essentially it cuts across all different sectors, cuts across health, it cuts across agriculture, it cuts across the labour market, jobs, skills, everything else. So in each of those aspects, we expect that gender, social inclusion, disability will be addressed. Then the other aspect here is have social norms and practices been considered? Because it's not enough to just say, well, yes, women were consulted or women were included. It's also about how have social norms been addressed? Because in many cases, it may be that technically there may be jobs available that women could do or adapt to, or farming practices, but the social norms might limit women or people with disabilities or those who are not socially included from doing that. So it's really important that we look at social norms and social norm adaptation. And essentially, how much decision-making autonomy do these groups have? At the most senior levels, in terms of government and governance, but then also on the ground as well, in the day-to-day lives, how much decision-making autonomy do the most vulnerable have? So as I mentioned, we had, with our methodology, in-depth interviewing, we interviewed around 60 people, but we are continuing to interview more. We used the GEDSI approach and adapted the ProWare, which is essentially a methodology looking at women's empowerment in agriculture. But we moved it beyond agriculture, looking at other aspects as well, in terms of skills, in terms of water and sanitation, in terms of decision making. And we used a photo voice, which is where women had cameras to take pictures of their daily lives and to explain how climate change had affected them. Also looking to do a survey at the next stage. So from that sort of macro perspective, where we are looking at the broad national action plans for climate change, our project also zoomed in to particular examples on Goromora Island. So just give you a bit of background information to the Sundarbans, which is where this has been happening. So the Sundarbans obviously is in India and Bangladesh, and we focused our area in India. There's been quite a bit of research already in Bangladesh, but not so much in India. It's an area which, has quite pronounced poverty, and most people, earn their living from agriculture and fishing. There's not a lot of industry there outside of that. And of course, it's made up of numerous islands on a mangrove forest and river delta. So it's a beautiful ecosystem with rivers, different rivers flowing through it, many different species. However, climate change has, radically impacted communities, and sea level rises have significantly impacted people there. So, unfortunately, quite devastatingly, sea levels are rising at, the highest rate anywhere else in the world, at a rate of 3 centimeters a year on average, which is really impacting people. If you can imagine, it's quite a dense population. People are living, straight up to the coastline. So any sea level rise has a big impact. And 4 islands have already been submerged. So it's an area where, there's rapid change. Islands are being submerged, as we speak. It's the sea level is rising. So there's 54 inhabited islands in this area, and each different island has a different vulnerability to climate change. So we see as well with the sea level rises, there's a lot of impacts. So it causes salinity of the soil, and that really degrades the agriculture. It also means that there's increased extreme weather events. So we see more cyclones, more flooding. For example, in the space of 2 years, there were 4 devastating cyclones in this space. And, they just come with little notice. They wipe across communities and leave people devastated. So, for example, Cyclone Amphan destroyed a quarter of the mangrove forest in the Indian Sundarbans. So you can imagine the impact of those severe weather events. So to deal with this, India has the National Action Plan on Climate Change in 2008, which was established. However, as we discussed in the beginning of the presentation, it only mentions gender once, and it really doesn't look that much in terms of disability or social inclusion more broadly. It is really of that sort of one-size-fits-all type approach. We also see there has been, thankfully, a fund as well established, but it's not always easy to access this fund. And each of the different states, interestingly, and there's some really interesting examples here, have different climate change action plans, and they all vary quite a bit. There's some examples of action plans which are much more gender transformative, and there's examples of climate action plans which don't mention gender at all. So the West Bengal State Action Plan is sort of more in the middle. However, even though it exists, it's really quite debatable whether anything has resulted out of it. It's more a question in many cases that these plans might exist on paper, but how much they're being adhered to is another matter. So just looking at this very particular area that we looked at in terms of a case study, it's Goromora Island. Now, it's only the size of 5 square kilometres, but it has around 3,000 people on the island, and already 70% of the island has been submerged. So it is quite a distinct ecosystem. The island has been badly damaged by the sea level rises because, on the island, most of the agriculture was fishing, and also, beetle plantations, different crops. But these have been damaged by the salinity of the soil. So the salty water has made it very difficult to make a profit there on the island. Now, that's okay for the families that have money and can relocate. Many have relocated to the mainland or to other islands. But for the families who are impoverished, and we're talking about very high levels of poverty here, they have no choice but to just remain and to continue doing what they're doing, but with very little ability to make any ends meet. So The other issue that you have is that many people don't want to leave because it's a very peaceful island. People from different religions get on very well here. There's not much tension, whereas, these are sort of reported in other areas. So people don't want to leave to the unknown, and particularly if they don't have, clear things, a clear understanding of what is out there or what opportunities there may be. And as I mentioned, the cyclones have really severely damaged people's homes. There's a lot of people still living in tarpaulins because their homes were damaged after these cyclones, and they're basically still living in emergency accommodation, but they don't have the means to change that. So the government, in terms of the government policy response, the government in West Bengal agreed to settle 30 vulnerable families, but as you can see, there's 3,000 people on the island, so it's a really very small amount. Plus the government settling them on Saga Island, which is a bigger island, but that's not without its own climate issues. It's also, suffering from similar effects of sea level rises and salinity of the soil. However, it's a start, and whether that translates to something bigger, we shall see. So there has been a coordinated response across ministries to try to settle these 30 people so far. So as I mentioned, this has lots of socioeconomic effects of climate change on the island and of lack of policy response to individuals there. So the increased poverty as people's agricultural means of survival decreases. There's been reported cases of trafficking of children and women and various scams. Schools, one school on Goromara Island closed due to flooding damage, just hasn't been reopened. It's also difficult to get teachers because people don't want to go and settle on an island that is, meant to be sinking. Also makes marriage prospects difficult, again, because the hope for the future seems more bleak. So in our work, we're not just looking generally, but looking at the particularly the most vulnerable groups. And so we were looking at how it had a disproportionate impact on women, the elderly, and people with disabilities. We also saw the lack of coherent policy response. Essentially, you see that people are caught between adaptation and migration, but to migrate, they do need assisted support. Or to adapt, they would also need support in terms of highly secure embankments. However, without either of those, they're caught in between both worlds. We see the children's development impacted through the lack of schooling opportunities, and also the social protection schemes are quite inadequate that are being offered, and some have been stopped altogether due to allegations of corruption. So there's also been a lack of coordination between different agencies, and at times the different government departments will say it's the other government department's area of responsibility. So when we zoom into the particular groups that we've been talking about, we see that a lot of men have left the island, have gone to work in other locations, and they'll frequently send back money, but those it's small amounts. They're not often very skilled in other areas. So women are basically left to hold the fort and also to manage then the different cyclone responses as they are there. So as I mentioned, government schemes have ceased, so they really have to make do with what they have. And in some instances, they might have the, means to be able to do more agricultural work, but the social norms have prohibited them. That there's a case of where a man and his wife were still on the island, but the man had severe disabilities. He was injured from his work, and the woman had to work, as a daily wage labourer. But they were facing a lot of prejudice, for that. And people were saying that, he was useless, and it was creating all sorts of tensions. So social norms also drive the limitations here that women face. Also, obviously, there's great vulnerabilities, women, when there's a cyclone response, they have to, they're caring for their children, they're elderly, many pregnant women suffered immensely, and they are the ones that have to guide the responses. And then for men, of course, it's not easy either, unless they've got some level of wealth, which most of them do not. So for many, they have migrated to work as wage labourers in other states. It's often from a tip-off that someone says, "Oh, there's a job in this state," so they end up going there. However, if you've seen any of the literature, migrant labourers, extremely exploited in different states, in India particularly, when they come from a different state. And as I mentioned, those that haven't gone, there's often sort of social norms that impact their daily lives, where they're discriminated against if they aren't able to work. So as I mentioned, children have had problems with their learning and their prospects and their education. People with disabilities, there's of course, physical vulnerabilities in times of disasters with the frequent cyclones. There's also inadequate healthcare, burden of agricultural labour, because much of the with the poor soil and the poor conditions, they have to do very physically demanding work, and if they've got injuries or whatnot, it makes it very difficult. Plus, again, the shame and social norms, stigma. And similarly, elderly people, many of them have been left behind on the island while their children have gone to other places for work, and that brings with it the issues of isolation, of increased vulnerability in disasters, lack of healthcare. They have to go to the mainland for healthcare. It's much sort of harder to access and to go. And, a general sort of inadequate support and access to government pensions. So just some of the, I guess, particular areas we were looking at too. We were looking at the water governance and how this is being made worse by the cyclones and the increased salinity of the water. So also the fact that in water governance and who's managing it is important, and the social norms behind that, and the social norms constricting women from managing it. That has been one issue. And in terms of food security too, we see that many people, were depending on the crops on their land, and mostly with subsistence agriculture, but with some, excess production to sell. But due to the increased salinity of the soil, this has been, really problematic. So people have been very dependent on any rations, and they're sharing in their local community. But that, has created a great sense of worry amongst people as well, when they worry where their next meal will come from. So some of the areas which, different NGOs and others have been looking at on the island around trying to improve conditions. It's still kind of preliminary, but some have looked at the skills training around processing and ways that they can improve the profits from what they do produce them. Also looking at any sort of gender training or sort of social norms change that can help, so that there isn't that discrimination against families, for example, where the women are the main breadwinners. And working with the community to help sort of improve the embankments and mangroves, and managing the water, particularly so the water sources don't get polluted. However, because it is caught between adaptation and migration, other skills training has also been one area that people have been looking at, because many will have to migrate. Essentially, there just won't be anywhere for them to sort of stay. So it really has been important that people do look to what skills there might be that people could do in, for example, in the cities, because many have been working in agriculture their whole lives. And so going to a city without any kind of distinct skills is very difficult, because then the conditions that they work in will be much more, exploitative. So for us, I guess that's sort of coming to the end here. What this sort of, looking at this very specific snapshot of life on this island has meant is, I guess, sort of we've been able to extrapolate from that what that means for the development of different climate adaptation strategies, plans, and policies. And as I mentioned, these can be at the state level, or they can be, with donor agencies who are assisting in their own climate adaptation plans. And we see, or they could be with local NGOs or local councils working on climate issues. And essentially we see how just having a one-size-fits-all approach really doesn't meet the needs of these individuals who have experienced such devastation. For women who are holding the fort across all the constant cyclones, and for people with disabilities who can't access the healthcare, for example, or for children who are not being educated. So I think it's something that we can all continue to work on in terms of where we are reviewing different climate action plans or strategies, that we're looking at whether they do have that focus on gender equality, on disability, on social inclusion. Thank you. So, and feel free to contact me too if you wanted to, share with me your work or anything else that any other additional questions you might have.
Thanks, Annabelle. Gosh, that's a really sobering account of the existential and complex crisis the threat and realities of climate change poses for the most vulnerable. And I thought you outlined the nature of the solutions being so incomplete was really quite interesting. So I think we're waiting for some questions to come through. In the meantime, what I will do is...
One question came through the chat as well, so...
Okay.
I can answer that if you like.
Yeah, sure. So this one says, so if you could sort of talk a little bit about your theoretical approach on empowerment.
Sure. I think that's a really great question because it's so important, and a lot of my work has been around empowerment and what empowerment actually means, because we see when we talk about empowerment and women's empowerment today, it often focuses on women's economic empowerment. It's often solely about money and what jobs women can have, but it doesn't look at other aspects of empowerment. So the approach that I've always used draws on Jo Rowland's work, where she looks at different aspects of power. So that's power within, power with, power to, and power over. And so empowerment should be about all those different aspects of power. So the power within that you have is essentially the confidence that you have, and whether you believe in yourself and believe that you are worthy. And we see with many of these women, for example, who are treated as less than human in many cases, they don't believe in themselves. And so that's really important. We can't just look at giving women money, for example. It's got to also be about that internal process of change. That power with others is more about solidarity and having connections so that we're not all just isolated individuals. Power two is looking more at the fact that, some may have sort of oppressive power over others and how we can respond to that. Sorry, that's power over. And then power two is ways that we can respond to that through different actions. So, for example, whether that's protests or that's being able to, stand up to that. So in terms of empowerment, then what that means in our project is we look at all the multifaceted aspects. So that's it is in part economic empowerment. So that's money, that's labor, jobs. It's also education, but it's also confidence, sense of self-worth, connections, social connections with others, and it is an ability to have decision-making power and autonomy to be able to stand up for what you believe in your community and to be listened to. So it's multidimensional. And Naila Kabir's work here is important. Thanks. Oh, there's another question that's come through, I can see.
Yes. So what kind of conversations around climate resilience and climate change exist at the local bureaucratic level in the Sundarbans region? We see in urban spaces in India that local bodies, guided by central level directives, are increasingly talking about climate resilience. It'd be interesting to know how these conversations are shaped in local governance in areas like Sundarbans.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a really important question, and I think it is something that definitely we have seen. I think that one could argue that the sort of state and national level responses to climate change have been inadequate here, but we definitely have seen at the local level that the local pradhan or councillor has been very active in advocating for the citizens on Goromara Island and others in the region as well. So I think that there is definitely advocacy from those groups. I guess it's just, how much that gets listened to at a sort of state or national level is debatable, but I think that it's certainly happening. And I think it's increasing as well. Thank you.
So if I could jump on the back of that question, in your presentation, you mentioned that corruption was an impediment to the way in which the local community could respond to the crisis that they face. I was wondering if you could, you touched on that, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that and the way in which I suppose local government and local politics works on the island.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, I suppose, as a case study, and I don't know as well so many other parts of India, but in West Bengal, everyone almost belongs to a political party, and so you'll see that the tensions, most of the tensions in communities will be from political differences and from the political rivalries and whatnot, and so there are often allegations of corruption, from one political group to another, and whether that's true or not, we don't know. But when those allegations come out, then that can hamper things like cyclone responses, because then there'll be accusations that there was corruption in them. So I don't know about that so much in terms of this area. What I do know is that the national government stopped some of their social protection schemes because they accuse the state government of being corrupt. Now they come from different political parties, and so there is a lot of animosity there, and there's no way of knowing whether there's any basis to those allegations or they are just political. But in the meantime, the people are suffering because they're not able to access different social protection schemes.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask also, you've mentioned a few times that local communities aren't consulted. To what extent was the migration policy that was, and the resettlement policy that was sort of put together? I think you mentioned 30 families. Was that sort of put together with any consultation, or was that sort of very top down? Yeah. So, and who are the likely families that have that are able to take advantage of a program like that?
Yeah, thanks. I think with that that policy, it's not public knowledge how it came about. So I looked it up carefully and the different documentation on that, but the public information is scant. So the simple answer is I don't know, but the longer answer is it's not sort of clear. There's no sort of public information that displays that. In terms of the 30 families, though, I mean, I think they've been chosen sort of carefully with the local councillor, which, on the one hand has the benefits that that they sort of, know the island the best. But I don't, it's not published, the sort of the different selection criteria. So I'm not sure. So
we have another question. My research resonates with some of your ideas and looks at marriage trafficking as propelled by the climate crisis, and hence a concern to be integrated in climate management and policies. Does the JEDC approach incorporate this social issue?
Yeah, 100%, because I think with the JEDC approach, it's looking at women, for example, and children, and those that are most at risk of trafficking. It's looking at all the different needs of women and children and all the different risks involved. So it's not just saying, okay, well, climate change is impacting, say, the soil, and that means that the farmers, will need different seeds, or they have to have a different embankment, and women, do this kind of farming. It's also very much looking at the risks that leads to. So I think that's a very important part of the approach, that it goes beyond just say, oh, okay, how many women are involved, or does that mean that women will have some money out of this, or they'll be able to benefit agriculturally, but it's also all the particular risks. So yeah, I'd be really interested to hear more about your research, because this is a real issue in the Sundarbans, and it's only been exacerbated by climate, that as people get more and more desperate, then they're more fall victim to these schemes, fake marriage proposals and fake job offers. So, it's very much interrelated.
Annabelle, I wanted to know, why did you and your team pick this particular island as your case study above the other ones for your project? I think you mentioned in your talk that there's 100 or so islands.
Yeah.
And they're all fragile from the different threats that climate change poses. So I was interested to know what made you pick this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really a question around our sort of skills and experience. So Professor Lahiri Dutt, had experience on this island, and I must also acknowledge the NGO Sudu Sundarbans Chacha, who Professor Lahiri Dutt had had worked with or had knowledge of, and they were able to, help sort of establish those, relationships with communities to do that research there. So I think it's just from the knowledge that she had, so that we weren't sort of just going in cold. And I think, you don't want researchers just sort of popping in and saying, hi, here we are, So I think it's important to us that we, do ethical research and, able to establish connections first and sort of not, and first do no harm. So that's why we focused on that area, but honestly, I think all of them would be very interesting case studies, and they all have slightly different, similar but different issues.
Can you give me sort of a context in which climate adapted policies were done well, which were sensitive to and responsive to the needs of people? And in that context, sort of what, if there are such case studies, what sort of incentives are there for governments to design good climate adaptation policies like that?
Yeah, thanks.
I guess what I'm trying to say, are there success stories that we can learn from?
Yeah, I'd really recommend to people that they read. There's a paper by Singh, Solomon and Rao. I can send it to people afterwards if they want. In 2021, it actually analyzes 28 of India's state action plans and compares them in terms of their response to gender and whatnot. And it's really fascinating paper, because it actually talks about how some of the states will just have no discussion of gender, no discussion of any particular vulnerability, but there are states like Bihar and Tamil Nadu which have really tried to tackle it in a more meaningful way. So I think that's a really good sort of starting point for people more interested to explore. The other areas around, there's the National Action Plan Global Network, which does work with different governments across the world on developing their climate action plans, and also working with them in ways to make sure that they are more inclusive of gender and particular needs of vulnerable groups. And they've been working with countries such as Ethiopia and Togo and Madagascar, and I think there's some really interesting examples there. So it's not to say that those examples are perfect or whatnot, but I think that there is certainly some work that's being done to acknowledge that there are better instances than others. Oh, and in terms of incentives, I think I guess the main incentive is around effectiveness, because if you don't look at issues of gender and social inclusion and disability and whatnot, then the policies aren't going to be very effective, because you might end up only serving the needs of, say, wealthy farmers in the community who might be able to adapt by buying, the more expensive seeds or whatnot. But that is not going to help if you have more communities who are impoverished, or more communities who are caught between migration and adaptation. So I think it's, I guess the main incentive is just to ensure that what you create is effective. So.
Can I ask also, where is the international community in all of this? What role can the international community play in terms of advocacy, or in terms of reshaping priorities or politics? And what does it mean in terms of policy?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And I think, I think there's a lot of tension, between different countries in the sort of global north and global south, so to speak, because we see that many of the emissions have been caused through the sort of industrialization of countries in the global north. And so then countries such as India have said, well, it's not up to us to sort of focus on our on climate mitigation strategies. It's it's your responsibility. So I think that there's problems if the international community as a whole is going to say, well, this is the way you do it, because I think honestly, I think the international community and the wealthiest nations have responsibilities that they haven't met up to, so I think important steps such as the creation of like a loss and damage fund for international countries to contribute to. But unfortunately, you see that many countries will sort of sign up to these agreements, but then they won't actually put the money behind them. So I think while it would be important for the international community to say, well, this is the best practice in climate adaptation, I think they also need to fund it. So I think it's important that we advocate as well for wealthy nations to help fund these efforts.
Okay, so we have another question. Increasingly, gender mainstreaming in development policies has been encouraged. From your work, did you come across instances of some cooperation between India and Bangladesh on the climate and gender front?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Bangladesh has done some really amazing work. There's some really amazing gender work that's happening in Bangladesh, and so I think it would there's a lot to learn from there. I think there have been some meetings where there's been more but intergovernmental meetings where they have discussed more of a cross-basin approach in the Sundarbans, trying to address some of the common issues, but that's been less around gender. I really haven't seen gender come up in those discussions. It's been much more around sort of livelihood management or protected species or sort of waterway management, and really not much around gender. So, but that I can't say categorically that there isn't anything. Maybe I haven't seen it, but I haven't come across that.
Annabelle, so to what extent you mentioned some of the increasing vulnerabilities that the communities on the island face. Marriage becomes more difficult, educating children become more difficult. How I guess what I'm trying to say is, in the absence of sort of effective policies from the state, has there been efforts from the local level to kind of mitigate the risks and the vulnerabilities to some of those social vulnerabilities that you mentioned? I know that you mentioned that elderly people are often left behind, and they're at the they find great kindness from their neighbors. With some of the other issues, how have sort of local communities responded to those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it has been a very we did find a very supportive local community there that did support each other in terms of, particularly when there's been cyclones and the different needs that communities have had. And you will see that after cyclones in particular, a lot of NGOs will sort of come in with relief or rations, or there might be national government sort of relief schemes. It's more after the cyclones that people don't have that kind of particular aid. And there's not so many sort of NGOs that are working there on a regular basis as there might be throughout other parts of the Sundarbans. It's a bit more remote, takes more time to get there. But certainly there is, a quite an ethos of support amongst the community there, and there is you know, a lot of reliance on each other, and a lot of trust too. I think it was actually one of the only places where they had this barter system during you know, the COVID lockdowns, and so people were not using money in many instances, but it was this kind of bartering, and Goromora was one instance of that. So I think that does make it even harder as well for people to feel like they can leave, because you know, this is a much better environment despite all the challenges than, you know, being very exploited in the city, for example.
So I wanted to ask, this is something we sort of, we were chatting about before the session started. My work tends to focus on Pakistan and its politics and its courts. So Pakistan's an interesting case where the courts have played an important role in placing pressure on government in relation to climate action. The Supreme Court has taken a very active role in pointing out gaps in policy, in implementation, and played a significant role in reading environmental rights into existing fundamental rights, such as rights to a clean and healthy environment, access to clean water, and a climate capable of supporting human life. All of these have been sort of read into the fundamental right to life and the right to dignity. And this has been quite a growing area of redress. But of course, there are profound limitations on what courts can do. Is there a domestic recourse for residents in the island? Where can people take their grievances to domestically? Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, sorry.
Oh yeah, and I was just going, or internationally, I was going to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a really important topic, and I think this is going to be something that we are seeing more and more, you know, in the coming decades. And we see, for example, you know, Vanuatu petitioning, you know, to take climate grievances internationally to the criminal court and whatnot. I think the bounds of my knowledge are limited here in terms of the law and the possibilities of the law. However, when we were talking about it, I was interested to look more, and you know, I had read some comparative pieces on Pakistan and India, and some were saying that, you know, there's a lot of potential in India in terms of its court system, and there really could be cause for redress and for human rights to be upheld, and particularly for climate justice. But that in many of the rulings that this hasn't happened, that the Indian courts have sort of followed more on the sort of neoliberal or conservative lines, where corporate interests have been prioritized over sort of green interests, and some of the rulings have not really turned out favorably. So I think perhaps people don't see it as a great you know, possibility, you know, to take that forward. If there was perhaps a galvanizing case, then that might do that. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, and I'm really, you know, I really didn't realize the extent to which the courts in Pakistan have been so, you know, such leaders of social change. So I think that's a really important case study for people to look at.
One question that's just come through takes a comparative perspective. Do you find similarity between the challenges facing India and the Arab region regarding climate change?
Thank you. I don't know enough about the Arab region to do that justice, so I think I'd need someone a scholar from that area to really expound on some of the issues. I do think that climate issues are, there's similarities globally, and certainly the issues around migrant workers who are forced off their lands due to climate change and who might be working in many of these. Interestingly, some of the people from Goromara Island, some of the men did go to work in the Arab region, for example, as migrant workers. But then we have, the issues of labour conditions and labour rights. So we see how, these issues intersect, with climate justice and labour justice. So, I think that's probably all I can say about that. But certainly, these are issues facing many communities globally.
Is the scope of the experience of some of the migrant workers, you mentioned, which were men, mostly men, is that part of the project as well, or does that fall outside of your the ambit of?
Well, I think it's so horrible because the instances are really horrible of exploitation you see. It is something we did want to try to capture, but just practically speaking, our area of conducting the research was on Goromara, so the only people we could speak to were, for example, men who had returned from working in migrant working conditions. So that we did include that, but it's not the same numbers of people that you might get if you went to, say, a work site and whatnot. But we simply didn't have access. So I guess the short answer is yes. But it's a really, really, really important issue because they really are treated in some of the worst conditions imaginable. And in terms of India, the ILO has done some really important work on this in recent years. There's a few really good papers that have come out documenting the rise of exploitation and the conditions of migrant workers. So I'd point everyone to that to look at that as well.
And so the men that return, is that because that they it's seasonal occupations that they perform?
Yeah, it just depends, and some, also sometimes the work runs dry. I mean, it's just casual day to day. They go and hopefully there's work the next day, but there's no promise of it. So it's often at building sites and whatnot. So if the work is completed, then they'll go back to the island and wait till they sort of get a tip as to the next place to go. So that was the case in this one man that we spoke to recently. So others, it will be a seasonal kind of labor that they're doing agricultural work, and they'll come back in the off season. So they will tend to sort of come back and forth depending on when the work's available. They'll do it, but there's no guarantee of it. So.
And that, I guess, puts their families in a particular precarious situation where the income sort of can ebb and flow, is, I assume, quite unpredictable. Would you say?
Exactly. And that's why the employers know they can treat them the worst, because they know they're so vulnerable and they have families depending on the income. So there's very little recourse, and it's something that I'm certainly interested in. And labor rights, but it's so hard, unless you have a sort of state willingness to regulate that, then the worst kind of practices imaginable occur.
Is there pressure on the state to address this? I imagine that during COVID, that really exacerbated the situation and the plight of migrant workers across the country. So has there been a build-up of that political momentum?
No, there's been basically, there is, like, India is, signed on to different international labour organisation conventions and whatnot, and the ILO will, produce reports and talk about the need to do that. But it's I guess, like many international institutions, it's a sort of toothless tiger. There's no way to make states do what they say they will do. And honestly, I think it is a case where the people who are migrant workers are the poorest, they're the most marginalised. And so for many, they're just not a priority, they're just seen as disposable. And so I think there's also inherent caste discrimination against different tribes or castes who are often doing that work. And if they're from other states, they're also seen as kind of foreigners. So there's not much public outcry to change the situation. And so there's not much political will to change the situation.
On the topic of caste that you mentioned, one of the interesting points I thought that you made during your presentation was mentioning that there was quite substantial sort of community harmony. There's people from different religions. There's living together quite harmoniously. Has that come under sort of threat as the community sort of fights for its existence amidst the threat that climate change poses?
Yeah, surprisingly not so much in Gormara Island. It really has retained a lot of community harmony, and I mean, not to say it's perfect or anything, but
Yes.
there really has been a lot less tensions than in some other areas, and maybe it is just a product of the small scale, being a small area that people get to know each other more and depend on each other. I don't know, but there hasn't been sort of exacerbated tensions, at least not that we have captured. So, yeah.
Is there a gendered element to it as well, in terms of, say, family situations, in situations of crisis, particularly political crisis? We sort of, see often the escalation of family violence and things like that. And would you say that's also the case on the island, or?
Yeah, no, there's definitely instances of domestic violence, and I think that there's well-established links between sort of financial and other stresses and climate change stresses and disaster stresses and increased domestic violence, and of course coupled with very patriarchal roles and prescriptive gender norms. So that is absolutely something that we've come across facing many women on the island, and getting worse.
I think we might, there's no other questions. We've got a small audience today. So I think we might wrap up a little bit early. So did you have any final comments, Annabelle, or anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I'm very grateful to the people on Gormara Island for sharing their stories with us. I really hope that, that they will continue to persevere in their strategies for trying to find community solutions. And I would love to be in touch with anyone if you have any different thoughts, you want to share your experiences as well. So, and I'm very grateful. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for talking to us about it. There was someone in the chat who left their email for you.
Sure. I'll take that down.
I've taken it down. I can forward that to you. So I think they're doing work that intersects with yours at some point. Thank you so much, Annabelle. I will pass the floor to Saeed, who will wrap up the event.
Thank you, Imran. Thank you so much, Dr. Delhanty. It was quite an engaging session, and thank you for sharing your research with us. And thank you, Imran, for chairing the session as well, and to everybody who joined us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events. So goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.